This podcast was recorded on the land of the Wadjuri Yamaji people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Welcome to the Defend the Wild podcast. I'm your host, Alex Livingstone. Thank you for joining us today. In today's episode, we continue the conversation at Wooleen Station, only this time with David Pollock. David and his wife Frances run Wooleen Station. Taking over the property at 27, Dave embarked on a journey to restore the hugely degraded leasehold land after years of ecological damage. This podcast interview was one of the most interesting I've ever done, namely because there were many insights and perspectives Dave offered that I had never been aware of or considered. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. I feel like Wooleen Station is really pioneering some very cool stuff in the farming space, particularly around dingoes. So I'm keen to chat to you about that today. I guess to start off, could you tell me a bit about Wooleen Station and what it is you're doing here?
I can tell you where it is. So it's 700 kilometres north of Perth, about 200 kilometres inland from Shark Bay. It's in the Mulga country, so semi-arid rangelands. All of our neighbours around here are pastoral properties, cattle properties. Yeah, it's a lot of things.
It's a lot of yeah. I mean, like it is a lot of things. I guess the way that I want to do this is kind of in three parts because there's so much to do. I feel like talk about prior to dingoes returning to Wooleen, after dingoes have returned to Wooleen, but then also talk about the tourism aspect of your business as well, because I think that's really cool and interesting. I guess, can you tell me about Wooleen Station in the years prior to dingoes returning to the property? What was the state of the environment and why?
Yeah, so before the dingoes came back, so like Wooleen is degraded, no matter how you look at it. The areas that are the most degraded are the areas that are most valuable for production, so the high productivity areas. So some of it's not that degraded, but it's the bits that are not really useful for pastoralism. So like the really nice bits, or what would have been the really nice bits, are now just blowing sand. And so Wooleen was definitely degraded. We had, when we first got here, when my parents first bought it, we had 14,000 sheep, which was, in my opinion, far too many. But on top of that, we had, 4,000 goats or more, and probably 15,000 kangaroos that nobody really ever counted because it wasn't really, you couldn't really count them. Well, you couldn't count them accurately. So that was all, that was just, that was what a station was. It was, we used to have dust storms all the time in the summertime. It was always hot. Like we spent, most of my memories, I feel like it was really hot and we were checking water. So we had 58 watering points across the property, which was, how big was then? 465,000 acres. And, we spent the whole summer checking waters and fixing them.
This is constant stress.
Yeah, just checking all the windmills. And then in amongst that, we would catch goats in the summer, which was really, it's quite, you could only do that when it was above 40 degrees. So that was really hot. And yeah, like generally, like we didn't make any money, like wool crashed just after mum and dad bought the property. So, there was never any money for all the things that needed to do. Dad, patched things up a lot. And yeah, like a lot of stress, I guess. Yeah. Lots of good times too, I guess.
But
like
stress.
Generally, a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And a lot of work and very little, if any, monetary
return.
Payoff. Yeah. I mean, Dad was, he doesn't like me admitting this, but he was, trading while insolvent for at least 5 years.
Wow. Yeah. And the property was degraded because it was overgrazed. Can you maybe tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah. So, it was developed as a pastoral property back in 1886. and they pretty much just put as many stock as they could put on it, for forever really. You just keep putting in new watering points, and every drought that came along, you would obviously knock the stuffing out of the pasture and the landscape, and then the numbers, the stock numbers would plummet, and everybody would blame the drought. Then it would rain again, and then the numbers would never get as high as they did before that drought. Then you get another drought, and the numbers would plummet, and then wouldn't get as high as the drought. The numbers wouldn't get as high as that previous drought, and so it just sort of ratcheted down over the years. So, so like it certainly wasn't profitable. Like the whole region wasn't profitable for a good 30 years.
Yeah, and you have dingoes on the property now, but previously there was dingoes absent from the property for like 50 years. Yeah,
so I mean, the last one disappeared in the 40s, but probably the majority of them were gone by the 20s. It took probably quite a long time to get those last ones. So no dingoes from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It wasn't until 2007 that I saw my first one.
Yeah. And how were they removed from the property prior to that?
They would have baited them with strychnine on carcasses, trapped them. I don't know if 1080 was much of a thing when they got rid of them. It might have been, but I think strychnine was more the poison that they had. I imagine they would have just baited it, like put poison on carcasses and left them somewhere the dingoes might find them.
Yeah, and then you said there was a pretty large workforce that was able to undertake that. It's like would be impossible virtually to remove dingoes from the landscape now.
Yeah. So they had a big labour force in order to achieve that. There was sort of 70 people working on Wooleen. A lot of them were Wadri people, so a lot of those people would have been tasked with getting rid of dingoes, certainly at certain times of year. So that's what enabled them to get rid of the dingoes, and then they pushed them all out to the desert and sort of held the line.
And prior to dingoes re-entering Wooleen, what kind of management did you have in place to manage the goats and the kangaroos? I know you mentioned you would catch goats, but how often and how many kind of thing?
Well, we'd catch 2,000 every summer, more, a few more, a few less, and we'd probably do couple of musters throughout the year. Some people just mustered because you got a lot for that. It was, it was quite profitable to muster because you get a lot from one thing. But if you're really keen on getting rid of them, which my dad was, then you trap them, try and get every single one. Try to get every one that you can get. But you always leave sort of half. We had a property next door who used to catch, sort of 15,000.
Yeah,
and let 7,000 go.
Yeah.
So let all the nannies
More
go
next
and
season.
sell all the billies. So, they would even if you did get every single one on your property before the next summer came around, you'd have just as many again. So, we used to catch goats, and they were worth money, so that made sense. And we didn't have much money, so And then kangaroos, we didn't really do anything about them really. We had a kangaroo shooter who was set up at one of the windmills that he liked the look of, and he'd come out and shoot for 5 nights a week.
Wow.
But that didn't really make much of a difference.
Yeah. Wow. I was actually speaking to Zali earlier about the grasses that used to be present here, and she was saying that there's actually grasses that are no longer present on Wooleen that were present in the past.
Yeah. There's a bunch of grasses that essentially they are the reason that this country was originally opened up for pastoralism in the first place.
Yeah.
They're the best production grasses, and we know that they used to grow here because the early explorers who were sent out here to assess the landscape for its pastoral potential said, there's Themata triandra here, like there's this and that. So we know they used to grow here, but, after, 17 years destocking on Wooleen, those grasses haven't come back except where we've thrown out the seeds.
Yeah, wow.
So, we bought seeds in and threw them in the creek, and probably took 5 years for them to get, or 5 years for us to actually notice the first one.
Mm.
But that shows that they can still grow here.
Yeah.
It's just that we've grazed them to the point where there's not even any seeds left in the landscape.
Yeah,
And I feel like that's probably a bit controversial. Lots of people think the seeds are just there. You just need the right rain and then they'll come up. But, our experience would say absolutely not. We've grazed the best species, a lot of the best species, to the point where they have to be reintroduced in order to get them back into the landscape.
Wow.
Which is actually our focus now.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah. Zali was telling me a little bit about that this morning. She was saying you have some seed nurseries?
Yeah, building a bunch of nurseries. We built one and that went really well. It's kind of my happy place because, you can imagine what the landscape used to look like in that place. So, we've got plans to build, 30 more.
That's so exciting. Yeah, I saw the grass out there and I kind of was looking at it like, oh, that used to actually grow here. Which is hard to kind of fathom. So, it's cool.
And this whole area had like a, when the Ag Department was doing any work here, the Ag Department doesn't really have anybody to do any work anymore. But, this area was regarded as not having any grass or not having any palatable grass, so nothing that's edible for the stock. We've got unpalatable grass, but nothing palatable. But of course, there was heaps of palatable grasses here. They've just all been removed. And the reason the grasses in particular have been removed is because the ruminant animals need two things in their diet. They need protein and they need energy. And we've got heaps of protein in this landscape. That's not really limited. Energy is a limiting factor. And the only place they can get their energy requirements in a dry summer is from those palatable perennial grasses. So they are the limiting factor for grazing animals. So that's why they got wiped out.
Yeah. And this is probably the last question for like pre-dingo times, but like what was the state of the riparian zones on the property?
Well, yeah, the river systems, the riparian areas they are the high productivity country, or the potentially high productivity country. So they're the sweet spots in the landscape. So they are always much more degraded than anything else, essentially.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so Wooleen Station is known for not killing dingoes, which is not currently the norm for a lot of pastoral properties. Can you tell me a bit about the timeline of dingoes re-entering the property and why you decided to leave them alone rather than control them lethally?
Yeah, so I saw my first dingo in 2007 and I had the opportunity to kill it, but I didn't because we had a visit from a guy who'd rehabilitated his property over in the Northern Territory. And he came over to our property and we came over to Wooleen and drove around and told us that what we needed was a road train full of dingoes. So, which kind of sounded like a joke at that point, but he was exactly right. And he just looked around at all the goats and kangaroos and said, well, you're never going to be able to fix it when you've got this amount of unmanaged grazers. When there's two things there. First is fixing it, and the second is managing it into the future. So first of all, you're not going to be able to fix it. But even if you did fix it, you wouldn't be able to manage it into the future because the problem remains in all these unmanaged grazers. So we decided I decided not to shoot that first one. And as they wiped out all the goats, I thought, well, this is exactly what he said would happen. And then started on the kangaroo population and took out thousands of them. So, it became clear that this was a big part of the answer.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what kind of impact, obviously you mentioned the kangaroos and the goats, but what other sort of impact have you seen in the landscape because the dingoes have re-entered?
So there's a lot more of all of the, measures for good ecological health, really. More diversity, those good pasture species coming back, more ground cover, to the point where, our little creeks and things now run clear, whereas they used to run a very murky brown, which it was just kind of assumed. And I feel like all through West Australia, probably other states in Australia, like it's just assumed that, these murky brown rivers are what we're supposed to have.
Yeah,
but,
right.
maybe I think only in a big flood should our rivers run sort of that murky brown. In any sort of medium flood, I think that our rivers should be flowing clear. It's just that there's so much exposed dirt, from erosion, and all little plants and leaf litter and stuff that would be there filtering out all that sediment as it moved through the landscape. It's just not there. There's nothing to filter it, so it just runs off a murky brown. So nowadays things run clear, which and it's still
really
it's
cool.
still find it crazy. Like we was going down the Murchison, a few days ago, and I'm still blown away by the fact that you can paddle down the Murchison in a canoe, and you can see the bottom of your paddle. You can't see the bottom of the water. It's not the Bahamas, but it's it's amazing.
Yeah.
For that to be that clear.
Yeah, I guess I probably didn't even consider it before talking to you, but I was like thinking how much sense it makes that when you're getting that runoff, that it's getting filtered more when you have more vegetation in the environment. Yeah, it's amazing. And impact on mesopredators, cats, foxes.
Yeah, foxes. We used to have heaps of foxes. I remember shooting 40 foxes. Oh, maybe 30. Maybe I'm embellishing the story. 30 foxes like in one night when I was a kid, just going from like waterhole to waterhole, and shooting. Like would have been a poor year, and lots of lambs around and things, and just shooting 30 foxes. We used to have heaps of foxes, but I haven't seen a fox for at least 10 years.
Yeah, wow.
So foxes all gone, as the dingoes and the goats and the foxes disappeared at the same time because of the dingoes. And we still have cats.
Yeah.
They affect how the cats operate in the landscape, and they probably eat a few kittens, the dingoes do, but cats can climb trees much better than dingoes can, so the cats can get away.
Yeah. And has less foxes in the environment resulted in more smaller animals like bird species?
Yeah,
reptiles?
so definitely some of the ground nesting birds like bustards. We've always had bustards, and they sort of move up and down the coast depending on, where the food is. But we never had adolescent birds or young birds, but started seeing a lot of adolescent birds and young birds because they're now breeding here. Yeah. And turtles. There's a lot of turtles in the river. Lots of turtle tracks. We once again we had turtles, but you'd very rarely see. You go 5 years without seeing a turtle.
Wow.
But now they're just tracks are everywhere in the river because they were such easy prey for the foxes.
Yeah. So essentially, like having the dingoes, not controlling the dingoes, has meant you don't have to control goats. You don't have to control kangaroos. You don't have to control foxes. Like, not controlling one animal has meant like so much less labor goes into controlling all these other animals.
I mean, yes, except that it's much more than that because we could never control the goats. We could never control the kangaroos, and we used to throw out baits for foxes, but it didn't really make any difference at all. I don't think we killed a few, but we do actually have control now. We certainly spend a lot of time on the goats. We didn't spend really any time on kangaroos and foxes before, but now that they are all controlled, especially the goats and the foxes, because there's none at all.
Yeah, they're gone.
Yeah,
they've been eliminated. I guess it would be awesome to talk about the way that you view dingoes as like a management strategy as a pastoralist, for other pastoralists, I suppose.
In terms of like grazing, moving the cattle.
Yeah, grazing pressure, and how I guess that's changed the way that you're farming as well. I know you've talked about being able to actually do rotational grazing now, whereas you couldn't before.
Yeah, so a big part of the problem, like the degradation that's occurred out here, is because we just haven't adopted good grazing strategies like rotational grazing. Because essentially once you graze in an area, you need to leave that area, especially if the plants that you're grazing are very long-lived. Yeah. You need to be able to leave that area and leave it to recover, essentially, from the grazing period. So that means you should just be moving your animals around, whatever circular sort of motion around your property, and not getting back to to the bit that was grazed until those plants are recovered from grazing. So that's generally regarded as being, whether you're in the English countryside or wherever you are, that's generally regarded as being, a good way to graze animals. But no one's ever done that here because there's never been any point in trying to rest anything, because we've got so many. We've had so many unmanaged grazers. So the Ag Department sort of estimated that the grazing pressure from goats and kangaroos was about 60%. So if you're not controlling 60% of the grazers, there's no point in managing the other 40% well, essentially. So, the dingoes have reduced the 60% goats and kangaroos down to, say, 5% just kangaroos, which means that now it does make a big difference, like what you do, because now you're managing 95% of the grazing pressure.
Yeah.
So now you can employ things like rotational grazing, which helps you to, once you've recovered the landscape, helps you to maintain that that level of ecological health.
Yeah. You've previously destocked for a period of time, haven't you?
Yeah, so we've destocked 4 years when I first took over. And a lot of that was because there was no point in reducing the stocking rate, because if you've got one cow in a paddock, then you need one watering point for that. And then from that one watering point, you could have 1,500 kangaroos drinking. So I thought, well, the only way I'm actually going to be able to reduce the grazing pressure is to turn off all the waters, get rid of all the cows, and then the edges of the property will still be grazed by the goats and kangaroos, but in the middle will be essentially properly destocked from grazing animals, and then we'll see how that goes. Yeah. And that actually went really well. There was some really good recovery, and that was, that plan was made before the dingoes came back. So we didn't actually know that dingoes were going to be an option at that point.
Did it end up coinciding with it?
Yeah. Because that was 2000. Well, actually, I destocked an area in 2004, but that was because we didn't really have the infrastructure to rotationally graze as we wanted to, we essentially used destocking as, part of rotational grazing. We're just rotating them off property, essentially, because we didn't have enough cattle paddocks to rotate them through Wooleen. So we just got rid of we rotated them through the paddocks that we did have, and then just sold them all. And then we would wait until we needed to buy cattle again. It was always the plan to sort of destock for as long as possible.
Yeah.
3 years was probably about what we could have done, but we did 4 years. Nearly the bank was trying to foreclose on us. So we pushed that a bit too far. But the recovery in the landscape is kind of exponential, especially for the plants that we really want to get back into the landscape, because for most of those really good plants, and they're all perennial grasses, they're not in the landscape at all as a plant. There might be some seeds. We were hoping there were some seeds, and for some of them there were. So you've got one seed per 100 hectares or something. Wow. So if you get a good season, which you won't necessarily get every year, then that seed will germinate and then throw out 100 seeds. And then next good season, you'll have 100 seeds come up and throw out 100 seeds. And the next season, you've got 10,000 plants come up and throw out 100 seeds. So to my mind, it was kind of like it should have been, and it kind of is. Now that we've been doing it for a while. Exponential in how it recovers, so especially for those good species. So we wanted to make the destocking go as long as possible, so that we could try and pick up some of that exponential growth. So we had 4 years destocking to begin with, and then I think it was a year with stock, and then it was another 2 years before we bought stock again. I think we had them for 3 years or something.
That's
and then
crazy. Like, sounds like it's difficult to destock, not so much like from the environmental side of things, but like obviously financial side of things. It's like a worrying thing to do.
oh, I mean, for most properties, that's their major income.
Yeah.
And I guess that's like a big part of our message. Like, our message is not that other pastoralists should do what we're doing, because they'll almost certainly go broke.
Yeah.
The message is probably for the greater public to say, look, we need to have a good look about how we're managing these properties, because like what we are doing needs to be done.
Yeah.
I just don't think it should all be the pastoralist's responsibility, because, you know, these properties were, you know, there was a royal commission into their degradation in 1941. You know, it's not really, you can't really blame that on the current day pastoralists. You could argue that they are continuing the degrading practices, but they're kind of trapped in the cycle. They don't really have much of an option out.
Yeah.
So, you know, I guess our message is more, look, these people, if we're going to continue to have a pastoral industry, then, you know, we need to have some regulation, so that, you know, people who don't care about the land are forced to care about it. But we also need to help people so that they can get the landscape back on track.
Yeah.
Because it is an incredibly valuable resource.
Yeah.
Incredibly valuable resource, you know, long into the future. So, but yeah, like at the moment, you know, it might be just two people managing 500,000 acres. They don't even own it. Like, they manage it on behalf of the government, because the government owns it. They just lease it. We were saying, oh, like, you're the pastoralist there at the moment. You're responsible for fixing 130 years worth of damage, which, and the money from that damage built Australia. You know, if you walk down your main street and there's a bank with 1904 written on it, guaranteed, like, a big part of the money that built that bank in 1904 came from the wool industry.
Yeah.
So we're just going to say, well, we'll forget about like what this country has given to the nation, and then we'll just say to the two pastoralists there at the moment, it's your job to fix 130 years of, you know, of overuse with whatever you can make off the degraded bit that's left.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Do you have a vision of how that might, like, big question here, so fair enough if you don't.
I love the big questions. Bigger the better.
Yeah, I know how
There's
you said
hope.
You don't think that everyone should do what you're doing particularly. What do you see in the future for people who are managing big areas of land? Like, how do you potentially break that cycle of, like a negative feedback loop almost?
Yeah, so up until very recently, we weren't allowed to do anything other than pastoralism. So changing those, you know, regulations was a big thing. You know, that's something we've been campaigning for 40 years, and last year they changed it so that you can do other things in a pastoral lease if you get a different sort of lease.
People just don't know that, though. I don't think. Yeah.
Well, that's just WA, but yeah.
Yeah, but even still, like,
no one in
that's
WA knows.
a really interesting thing. Yeah, that you just couldn't do anything other than pastoralism.
Yeah, and I feel like, because I was on the Rangelands Natural Resource Management Board when the live export trade sort of hit, and you know, the trouble with that, and I was like, well, they couldn't export their cattle. They had no option but to keep them on the land. Like, that's just massively, like, half the animals were supposed to exit the system, but all those animals stayed.
Wow.
It's like, well, that's just putting an incredible amount of pressure on that landscape until they can get rid of them. Yeah. They can't even, I don't even think they could even shoot them. It was just, like, you know, people don't really understand like what the implication is for, you know, the landscape even. Not saying like
I've never thought about that either.
Yeah, I'm not even like, well, you know, we sent letters to people saying, like, because that was our area. That's Rangelands NRM. That was our area. It was like, have you considered like you know, how much pressure this is going to put on the landscape? I mean, in terms of like, I'm not necessarily pro or against
the live export trade,
but
it's a side of things that a lot of people wouldn't consider.
It's like you stipulated these people. I mean, you know, fair enough. They want to be pastoralists. You know, a lot of them want it diversified, but you know, it can't. It would make it difficult. Or like us, they just diversify anyway and act outside of their lease for, I don't know how long we've been doing it, at least 20 years.
Yeah.
And just tell everybody at every opportunity that we are in breach of our lease. Because it's just crazy. These people are, their pastoralism's all they're allowed to do. And it's like, now you're not allowed to do pastoralism. It's like, well, now we're going to take away your market. It's like they're not allowed to do anything. I was like, how does that work?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Might zoom back just to dingoes for 2 seconds before I move on, because I feel like this is a good segue to tourism as well. But no calf losses on your property, and I know that comes down to like some management as well. Can you explain to me why you think you haven't had any calf losses?
So we haven't had any calf losses to dingoes because the calf losses are related to how far the cows have to walk from the water in the summertime to the food. So they have to water. Pretty much all those watering points are man-made watering points. They have to walk to the food. But because the watering point might have been there for 100 years, all the food that's close to that watering point was eaten a long time ago, all the perennial food. So the food that would be there in the summertime has disappeared. So on a lot of properties, the cattle are walking out 6 or 7, up to 10 kilometres to get to the food, and then 7 kilometres back to get to the water every day. So doing 12, 14, 15k round trips every day. So if they have a calf at that time, the calf can't walk 14 k's in a day. So what the cow does is it leaves its calf out in the bush, and then it races into the water and races back to the calf. But if the cow takes too long, and they will take too long if they're walking 14 k's, then their calf will be unprotected for a longer period of time. And it's not likely that a dingo will find them, but if a dingo does find an unprotected calf, dingoes are pretty curious. And even if they had never killed a calf before, they'd be like, what's this thing? It's not that big, smaller than a kangaroo, can I eat it? And so that's when dingoes probably learn to kill calves and do kill calves, or at least attack them so that so they get bite marks, and that devalues the carcass. So from a pastoralist point of view, they might not have killed that animal, but they've still, lessened its value.
Yeah.
So the solution to that is better grazing management. Moving the cattle into an area where, like a new area, so there's food close to the watering point, so the cow doesn't have to walk very far, and the calf can go with the cow. Or if the cow leaves the calf in the bush, they're only leaving it for 20 minutes or something. Yeah, so that's in my opinion, that is the reason why you get lots of calf losses somewhere and not many in others, and not many pastoralists. I mean, not many pastoralists in the Murchison complain of calf losses at all. But if they do complain, it's only ever in poor seasonal conditions, droughts, those sorts of things.
Yeah, okay. All right, tourism, because Wooleen is not just a cattle station, it's also a really successful ecotourism venture. Can you tell me a bit about that side of the business and kind of how you got to where you are?
Yeah, so Mum and Dad bought the property in 1989, and then Wool crashed the next year, so they sort of floundered along a bit for about 3 years to try and figure out what they were going to do. But then they looked at growing citrus and something else, and decided on tourism, because we've got big homestead, beautiful homestead and garden. Mum was a really avid gardener, so we decided to go into tourism. And that was only supposed to be a 5-year sort of thing while the wool industry was rubbish, but the wool industry is still rubbish. So they've continued to develop the tourism product. And when Frances came along, tourism is her passion. So she really turbocharged the tourism to the point where now it's definitely our major income. And so it works really well with pastoralism, but also with how we're trying to rehabilitate the landscape, because people want to know about that. And Wooleen's a place where they can come and find out about what has happened to this landscape, what the possible solutions are, and what that looks like. So it sort of ties in nicely with what we do.
Yeah. So tourism would be, as you said, your main sort of gig here now at Wooleen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It may not be into the future, but it is now. Yeah.
For now, yeah. And what kind of experiences can people sort of immerse themselves in while they're here at Wooleen?
Yeah, so, I mean, it sort of depends on what, we've got 3 different sort of things. We've got camping, in which case, all our campsites are remote, in quite sort of nice spots. So if that's
very nice spots, can
yeah.
confirm.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so there's that. There's self-contained guest houses. So, if they want to be able, want a bit more than camping, but cooking for themselves. And then they've got in the homestead with Francis and I, sit down meal every night. And then they get to chat to us and, find out what we're doing. I mean, I do tours for everybody and things. So, and there's other things, there are walk trails and bike trails and hiking trails and, maps that send them off to nice places. There's other ways to learn about what we're doing. But, so that's...
Tell me about the sunset tour.
Oh, the sunset tour.
I need to know,
it's
like,
great.
The boulders, which you actually did the Shrek reference when we got there. I'm sure you've done that many a times before.
Yeah.
But they're old boulders.
They are old boulders. So, yeah, the granites that we have here are the oldest landscape you can look over on Earth. Those granites are 3.6 billion years old. The oldest rocks on Earth were found just about 100 km north of here. You can actually see the hill where the oldest rocks in the world were or are from the rock that we go to on Sunset Tour. But in order to get to the lovely rocks at the end, you have to listen through at least an hour and a half of me talking about issues that the pastoral industry faces. Although there's a lot of I guess it's we point out what that actually means in the landscape. Erosion and the plants that are recovering and the plants that are that have held on through all of the degradation. So yeah, it's a bit more than just watching the sunset. In fact, it's not really much the sunsets, but like that's how we get people on the tour. They always look confused, but no, most of the people know what we're doing and they know what they've signed up to. There's always a few people that are like, why is the sunset tour leave at like 3:30?
We need time to talk.
Yeah. We need to talk about grass.
Yeah. You mentioned erosion, and I feel like I'm circling back again, but have you seen a change in how rapidly erosion is happening since dingoes have re-entered?
Yeah, erosion's a tough one. Like even just like a couple of years into the destocking, I was on the boundary and you'd swear that both sides of the boundary were in similar condition. So, because when you look at the condition of the landscape, what I'm looking for, like the plants, but it was too early for those long-lived sort of plants to be coming back into the landscape. So, and a little shower of rain went through, and on the neighbour's side, it was just puddles everywhere. And on our side, not a single puddle. You couldn't see a single puddle. And it's like, there's a lot going on here that you can't really see. And, I guess that sort of changes has ended up in, the fact that our rivers flow clear. Yeah. I've forgotten what the question was.
Erosion. Have the dingoes had a impact on the erosion?
So,
has it changed for you?
I mean, they definitely have. And the erosion that's really noticeable is like the gullying erosion. And once that starts, like really nothing, maybe not nothing, like you can get in there and intervene and stop it. Yeah. But like it is really, there's so much of that, and that's just creeping inexorably towards the top of the catchment. Yeah. So, there's still plenty of that around. Sort of areas without much slope tend to rehabilitate themselves reasonably well, unless they're severely degraded, in which case, I don't know how long that takes. I mean, the Ag Department estimated 50 to 60 years. So, who knows? Yeah. There's some places that just look the same as they did.
Yeah.
back in the 1930s, I reckon, when we had a big drought and destroyed a lot of it. But yeah, I mean, so the erosion fixes itself on a scale that you can't really see. I guess the erosion that you can see is probably, like, it's hard to stop that. And it's also, I guess, when you're looking at it all the time, it feels like nothing's changing.
Yeah.
But like there's incredibly small changes happening all the time, like the cryptogam, which holds the soil together, is getting better and better, and that's reflected in those larger indicators, like the water flowing clear of the landscape.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that totally makes sense. I have seen a lot of, like, your commitment to country sort of in the facilities here. You obviously have some solid values that underpin, like, the tourism aspect and sort of the conservation work that you're doing here. Can you maybe talk about that? Like, what are those principles when people come here? What can they expect?
I guess first and foremost for me, it's that just because we make money out of tourism doesn't mean that it's okay to make something worse, even if it's something. I mean, I can't completely say that because our hike trails erode a little bit. It's kind of it's an interesting one because, like, whenever people are in the landscape, they tend to have an impact. Yeah. And it's really important for people to be in the landscape so that they value it.
Agree.
Otherwise, they're not going to protect it, sort of thing. So it's a bit of a trade-off, I guess. But when it comes to, should we let people do this or should we let people do that? Like, my thing is like, well, what would the waterbirds think about that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, the waterbird's not going to like it. It's like, well, I'm sorry. Like, I know you'd love to do it, but
the waterbirds won't like it.
Yeah, the waterbird said no. So I guess that is a really sort of that's definitely a principle that we sort of work by. But another one's like the cultural impact. So there's some really beautiful parts of Wooleen that we just don't let people go because there's just such, it's got such cultural value for the Wadjuri people, and people can go there and they would have a great time and not try and do anything disrespectful, but at the same time be very disrespectful in what they're doing. So that's probably the biggest thing, to be honest. Like, that would be why I didn't open up really spectacular parts of Wooleen and just have camping everywhere. And you could probably get people to do good things in the landscape that could mitigate the bad effects that they were having, or at least they could pay me their camping fees and then I could mitigate that. But a big one is like not letting people go to places that they have a really high likelihood of being disrespectful in one way or another. Yeah.
And so you are obviously fairly well connected with the traditional owners of this area. Can you maybe tell me a bit about any work you might do with them or any connections that you have with them?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was growing up here, we were the last station in the Murchison to have a camp of Wadjuri people. Like, every station had a camp of Wadjuri people, and they only live like just on the other side of the workshop. There's the huts that they lived in are still there now, but they didn't leave until 2004. So I kind of grew up with Wadjuri people. I wouldn't say, like, we kind of, since we destocked and stuff, we just haven't had the capacity to employ anyone for such a long period of time that we didn't really. Oh no, that's not. I mean, we do work with Wadjuri people. We don't. We've got like a couple of ladies that come and talk to school kids when they're out on the property. Whenever there's stuff that we want to do that might be, close to something, of cultural significance, then we're obviously going to work with them. But, we don't employ any Wadjuri people, although we've just built a new reception building, and there's going to be a cafe there. And so there's an Aboriginal community next door, and we're hoping to get some of the school kids out to just do a bit of work experience, or get a job if that's what they wanted to do in the cafe. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah.
Yep. People can do dingo experiences here. Can you maybe tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so we've got Steve and Eulalia. Eulalia's very dingo in her temperament, so you probably won't see her. But Steve's very outgoing. Yeah, he's a boy dingo.
He's a boy.
So he loves meeting new people most of the time. So yeah, we got a couple of dingoes purely to increase our capacity to educate people about dingoes. So we've got Zali. She was doing dingo talks last year. So she's been working at the Australian Dingo Foundation for 5 years. So she was doing dingo talks for us last year, and she's used to doing them with a dingo, and so we've sort of and then we talked with the Australian Dingo Foundation, and they were like, yeah, it'd be really great if you had some dingoes, and you could do the same sort of thing as we do in Victoria, but in WA. So after lots of toing and froing about whether it would be a good idea to get a couple of captive dingoes, because they are a lot of work. They're not like having some dogs. We've got heaps of dogs and they're easy, but dingoes are a different kettle of fish entirely.
Yeah, ball game.
So now this year we'll be offering dingo experiences, still doing talks, and then if they want to meet Steve and Eulalia afterwards, then they've got some treats in their hand. I'm sure Steve will be all for it.
Keen eyes. Yeah. I think that's all I want to talk to you about, unless you have any wisdom to bestow, maybe a message for anyone listening at the end of the podcast about Wooleen or what you're doing here. It's your moment.
Oh, really? This is my moment. I've got nothing.
No. No, that's all good. I feel like people should come here and see it for themselves, and they'll see the magic of Wooleen.
Yeah, if you're interested in where your food comes from. Yeah.
Learn how to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.